You'll see that we've reconstructed our speakers from the day with a couple of exceptions. One is that unfortunately Russell Hodge had to return to work, and Sir Mark Walport has amazingly turned into Tony O'Connor during the day. So Tony is going to give a government perspective. What we just wanted to do at the end of the day was give a little time for more general discussion, really, on some of the things that we've been talking about during the day. There have been 8 really interesting talks, taking quite different perspectives on different areas of the field of analytics and big data. I think, just reflecting on perhaps 4 themes that I've noticed during the day, you may agree or disagree with those, but maybe just perhaps try and give us some thoughts on some of the things we might want to discuss about at this point. One of the questions that's recurred throughout the day, in fact started right at the beginning when Sayara introduced it, was the question about, is it the data or the question that comes first? In terms of data as well, I think the issue right through to the last talk around the quality of data, when we're dealing with big data particularly, about sharing that data and the security of data is really quite an important issue. I was very much struck when Don was speaking about the element of what is the response of, perhaps taking this closer to home, what is the response of the field of OR to the huge growth, massive growth there has been in analytics. And perhaps the 4th area I was just reflecting on was the opportunity for us as analysts that we are afforded by the availability of big data and the nature of big data that we're now faced with. What I just want to do really is open up the opportunity for anybody to ask a question of our panel here, and then we'll just have a chance to have some feedback. There is already one question at the back there, so let's take it away.
Hi, it's Steve Black. I want to ask the really big question about big data. So we've had a lot of people try and define it, and the conventional wisdom and a lot of the propaganda says we get more data, we will therefore get more insights. But there has been, certainly in the last year or so, some criticism of that propaganda and that idea, which I haven't really heard people reflect on very much. And the criticism goes along these sort of lines. So there's a sort of haystack fallacy. You don't find the needle more easily by putting more hay on the haystack. And that's one way of thinking. More data doesn't necessarily doesn't make it easier to get insight. And there's another sort of criticism which relates to that, which is very familiar to people who work in fields like epidemiology, which is that the more data you get, the more you search for, you may find that the false positives increase rather faster than the true insights from big data. So I wonder what people's views are on that problem.
Is there somebody who'd like to start to answer that easy question?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. More data doesn't mean more accuracy or more insight necessarily. It's understanding which of those elements of data are going to be useful. Say predictive insight, that's what we're doing. And so the tool set that underlies inducing the rules beneath a huge data set, particularly when it becomes extremely dimensional, is very interesting. Which is why we spent most of our early years working on inductive logic, and that's how we started in bioinformatics particularly. Of course, Stephen Muggleton was behind that at Imperial using bioinformatics. And that proved to be a very rich source of techniques to be able to extract needles somewhat faster than we could before. Because the problem with big data is we've never looked for these needles before. We've never looked to see where a number of friends on a Facebook page combined with something else will tell us something. So being able to induce those rules back using AI systems very rapidly has been invaluable. So it is possible to do that. But you're right, just throwing more data at the problem doesn't help at all. It's understanding the nuggets that we're going to get into those. And then once you've got them and understand which ones they are, it's keeping hold of them at a level of quality that remains predictive. So you're right, those are the 2 issues you have to face.
Yeah, so I definitely agree as well in terms of the false positive side, and I think we as analysts have a role there. So I think the some of the kind of laws that people in the business understand around statistics, around p-values, now actually don't seem to apply, because if you have more and more data you can throw at it, a p-value of 0.05 is no longer something that is going to pull out a significant result, because you're just throwing more and more data at it. So I think there's definitely a role of analysts to understand what the impacts are of more data, and to make sure that that education goes beyond just people working on the data.
If I would just add to that, I think it goes back to what Mark Paul said earlier on, that if you do start with the question, because you have so much more data to work from, it enables you to ask more questions that you probably wouldn't have thought about, because the data wasn't there to begin with. So it gives you the entry point, and then it gives you just a much larger map to navigate. So the validations and the criticisms are correct in that it doesn't help you get more insight, but it certainly brings to mind more questions to ask that perhaps wouldn't have occurred to you before.
I'm sort of going to tell everyone, Antonio Connor, for those who don't know me, I'm Chair of the WR Service, and I don't have the same moustache as Mark Walcott. I'm just going to repeat something I said at the launch of the Analytics Network a couple of years ago, that I don't think it's about the data, and I don't think it's about the analytics. I think it's about the analysts, and that's where the real value is, in converting the data into information, making that information into insight, and it's the insight that then informs the decision-making process. And it's only by adding the analysts in and thinking creatively about what you've got and how you use it that you get the real value. Yes, you can put more data on there. Yes, you can link it to get greater information. But it's only when you start to analyse it, possibly cross-referring to the questions, that you get the real insight and value out of the system.
Yeah, just on the question of the epidemiological study, I think one of the things that's sort of not mentioned is to draw a distinction between work that is supposed to be confirmatory in nature versus work that is hypothesis generation. So a little bit like this idea of you start with a question, you obtain the data, you ask more questions, but to be honest about the fact that it is hypothesis generation, it's not meant to be confirmatory.
I should just say that if anybody wants to make a comment about a question from the audience, then please do as well. Just indicate, or put your hand up. Let's take a question or comment from up there.
My question and a reflection on what's been said. Some other commentators in the world of big data have also suggested or pushed forward the idea that we should abandon the search for causation and just move to correlation, because we're dealing with big data. It doesn't matter if we understand whether having friends on Facebook is related to your credit risk or not. The fact is the data shows that pattern. So in my mind, that links into the world big questions around privacy, especially in the public sector. It's potentially one thing to say that your number of friends on Facebook is related to your credit risk. It's another one to suggest it might be related to your propensity to commit crime. And I was wondering if the panel had any reflections on this use of data and the issues around privacy, and inferring behaviours from it and people's propensity to commit things.
I've been asked that question a number of times in various places I've spoken. The one thing I would say is the question of privacy, I think, is a question for today, and the future generation may have a different view on it. So we often talk about the younger generation being very revealing on social media sites, and it doesn't have as much of an impact on them as we, the older generation, may think it should have with them. I feel that we see privacy to be an issue in the life we experience, but as the next generation comes through, privacy, I think, is going to mean something else to them. And the issues that we think needs to be tackled today, in my view, will not be the issues the next generation feel they need to tackle. So I think privacy is actually a very fluid definition that's yet to come to a landing.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up something from Edward Tufte, who's the sort of expert on data presentation and visualization from quite a few years back, and he put out something which basically said that correlation isn't causation. It sure helps. And there is something about there that but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So it probably leads you into that space that you're going to go back and ask more questions rather than you found actually answers. And on the data privacy thing, I mean, I thought Alan's presentation absolutely fascinating and in some ways quite scary about what people might know about us. I think I can reassure you that the government's IT and the ability to link data systems isn't as strong as that, so we don't know as much about you. Yet.
There's a hand up here, Gavin.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the possibly changing nature of privacy with younger people and use of social media. I think it's quite dangerous to look at how young people are using social media now and assuming that that will continue through their life. I know when you're young and you think only your friends care about what you do, you may be willing to put everything out there. But then when you get a bit older and look back and think, oh Christ, what have I done? It may become more of an issue.
Michael?
Hi, forgive me, it's a little bit hobby horse-ist, but we've heard a lot today about new techniques, new technologies and the demand. What implications does that have for training at university, schools and vocationally?
It's very hard to find AI researchers in the UK. I'd like to find more. And we've talked to a number of the universities, to some of them and others about this, who've had history, have some really excellent resources, but there just aren't enough people coming through the system. And so I think there is a known, growing, worldwide shortage of advanced analytics, training. Companies are becoming aware of this, and particularly some of the big consultants are now aware because they're snapping up, particularly in the States at the moment. So I think there is an indication that the UK has the skills and the institutions to do an awful lot more than it is doing now. We would love to set up a lab here, but there isn't the resource pool to do it.
Yes, actually at Warwick Business School we have just recently been revising our master program in business analytics, specifically actually trying to tailor the program more towards actually what, for instance, the Royal Society, what informs are putting out there as a definition of what actually analytics is, what skills are required, both hard and soft skills. So actually one of the things that we found for our own program is, by the way, I'm the academic director for that program, is that we actually didn't cover so much about particularly the soft skills regarding actually selling analytics to your superiors, because I think, at least based on the feedback that I've gotten from companies, one of the big issues is if you have got some guy who's trained on the methodology and is very apt at your modeling stuff, that does not necessarily imply that this person is also good actually at communicating to managers who haven't got any background on analytics at all, what this is all about and what the important business insights are. So that's one of the things that I think programs actually need to highlight, basically.
Yeah, and I'd like to just second that. I think the days of having an analyst that sat in the back room in the dark and just did algorithm after algorithm are long gone. Analysts now have to interact with all manner of colleagues, cross-discipline within their own team, with business colleagues, with sort of academic collaborators and what have you. And in a sense, those skills will emerge as stronger than necessarily having airtight technical skills, which relatively can be taught fairly easily in the more supportive environment. But to have team members that can go and communicate with folks whose results of your analysis they're depending on, I think should rate very, very highly.
I'd like to twist your question ever so slightly and just say, when we talk about the emergence of new technologies, what impact will that have on education? It could quite easily be argued there is enough information out there for you to teach yourself anything. And we have the evidence of IBM Watson possibly being the next doctor, in that it surfs the net endlessly and has enough information
Don, I don't know if you've got any comment from the US cap perspective.
Sure. I think that the vast majority of companies are still looking for any source of talent and skill they can find. Universities in the U.S. are trying to respond, and there are, last I counted, more than 40 master's programs in business analytics either being offered or in development, and they're all over the map. Some of them are computer science programs in drag, some of them are OR programs and analytics in name only, some of them are statistics programs and analytics in name only, and some of them are really trying to cover analytics as a distinct separate discipline and as an interdisciplinary area, which is what I suspect it is. And this is wide open. I don't think anybody in academia has a strong fix yet on what it takes to do analytics. I was interested to hear that, that Warwick is thinking about the U.S. and the Informs approach and the ORS approach, and I think that's interesting, and I think there will be programs like that, but this is very much a work in process. And so a lot of this will depend on dialogues that we're going to have with employers to find out what kind of talent and skills they want.
Can I ask a further question on education? And rather than the analyst side, what about the general population? Do they need to learn more about how this sort of thing is going on? Or do they need to be simply mindless drones on the end of clever algorithms? Should schools be teaching more about data and how it's being used and so on?
I think, well, yes, is the obvious answer. But I think there's a role. There was an event some of us were at last week on modelling complexity, and Bernard Silverman, the chief scientist and chief statistician of the Home Office, was there, and it sparked off a bit of discussion around the fact that one of the key parties in educating people around data and analytics and other aspects of complexity is actually the journalists. And in developing the policy-making process, it's how we engage with journalists, and the put it this way, the more intelligent journalists are actually commentating on some of these processes. So we saw Ben Goldacre referenced earlier, Tim Harford from the FT is often putting stuff out there as well, and it's getting those people and engaging with those people rather than challenging them, I think is a role that we all have to play. Certainly, I know that's true from within inside government, in order that they have a better understanding and we get our messages across about what we're really trying to do about transparency, open data, privacy, confidentiality, all of those issues.
I think certainly we as a human being going about our daily lives are finding ourselves burdened with more and more information. And there's been, I think, a very slow, drip-fed responsibility and accountability handed over to the general public, that the information's out there, therefore you should know about it and you should make a judgment on that, and that's your call. If you don't do it, far be it, and can you plead ignorance anymore? No, because all the information's out there. So I think it is heading in that direction, but whether it's the right thing, I'm not sure.
Let's go. The hand thing been up for a while at the back. Is that? Yep. Yes, on the right-hand side. The right to me, I should say. Yeah,
thank you. Paul Tuxworth. Well, one cross-cutting issue that has arisen across the presentations is the ethics of consent rather than privacy. For example, does a person entering an application form for credit realise that the actual way that they do the application might actually affect whether their application is accepted or not? So I'm interested in some of the sort of broader issues of the ethics of use of personal data, not just from a privacy point of view, but in terms of, do they understand the uses to which that might be put?
I wonder, Dan, if you've got, to put you on the spot.
talked about before, we kind of have terms and conditions in place, but then the question is, to what extent do people go through that and actually understand, firstly, how their data is being used and what data is actually being used. I think we have a role to play in making sure we understand where the boundaries are, but I think equally it works both ways. So the more data that is available to us, the better decision we can actually make, and that actually may end up in a better result for people as well. So I think there's two sides to that as well in terms of the consent.
Anybody else would like to comment?
Yeah, just coming, this happened today actually. The RSS have just put out, the Royal Statistical Society have just put out an announcement in order to fuel the debate around care.data. So I think we had Mark talking earlier around history spectrums, which I thought were a really useful way of looking at it, because it isn't a binary issue and it is quite complex, and there is something about educating the public about the value of it. But they said that the transparency, I'm actually reading this from their website, came out at lunchtime, transparent accreditation of data users, uses and users is essential in what they're doing to make sure that they stop any confidentiality breaches. It should be an opt-out rather than an opt-in basis for sharing GP data. That was one of the most contentious aspects of the care.data process. But they should put rules and procedures into place that prevent individuals being identified, and that may even need a new statutory body to oversee it. So the debate is going to carry on for a little bit of time, but I think it is going to be a very difficult area. There is so much value to be gained from using this data for purposes to actually understand better research, targeted services, targeted medical interventions as well. But there is that real risk that once we identify one individual, and I'll use the Germans in another way here, if they start to mine this data in a very intelligent way and start to identify celebrities and put it out there and bring characteristics to them, the whole system could come down. And I think there's a real risk that if we really clamp down on the transparency and the sharing of data, we will put ourselves back in terms of analysis and analytics for quite some time.
Just add to that. So actually I think one quite nice idea to overcome this privacy issue is maybe also the creation of these platforms that essentially act as a trust broker. So I've been hearing actually several developments currently taking place, one of which actually in the Warwick Manufacturing Group, but also others elsewhere, where essentially the idea is really to have customers on the one end, firms at the other end, and then some agent in the middle as a trust broker that actually possesses all the data, that just passes on the part of the data that actually the customer explicitly has agreed for that specific purpose to be used. So I think that's actually, at least in my opinion, quite sensible way forward possibly to overcome this problem.
They'll be talking about exactly that principle with medical data. It's called safe havens, organisations which can actually look after the data and control it, pseudo-anonymise it, and answer questions for you on a request basis.
Okay, just Gavin on the back up there.
Hi, I'm a little bit biased because this is my background, but I would see machine learning and AI as one of the next big things that's going to define data analysis over the coming decades. But I don't see it as something that the OR community has necessarily embraced as much as the more sort of mainstream analytics and big data world. I just wonder if anyone had any comments on that.
I think certainly in my own experience of the Operational Research Society, when I joined as a student while I was doing my degree, business intelligence and data warehousing was just being introduced, and the OR Society was the one that introduced me to it. The fact that the OR Society may not have pushed it along as much as perhaps some of the vendors or some of the organisations that have implemented it may suggest that the OR Society hasn't pushed it along and hasn't embraced it as much as it could. I think the same scenario is happening with artificial intelligence and machine learning, in that it's there, it's being introduced, we're introducing it now, and we are perhaps learning from our previous experience, and we are now embracing it and pushing it forward. So if it hasn't been evident in the past, I think that's going to change going forward.
Okay, I think a question just here. Keep ignoring you, so your chance.
Hi, so I'd be really interested to hear your views on crowdsourced analytics. So this is so websites like Kaggle, where companies, individuals, academics can post large data sets online, anonymised for anyone to kind of download, and using open source tools like R, just have a go at analysing. And then they post say a small prize fund, which is divided up against the people whose algorithms score best. Would that be something that your companies would consider using?
I'm not sure I have a company, but I think it's a good idea. I think any way which allows us to improve the way that we do innovation and understanding the analysis is a good thing. Though only last week, I think TfL put a load of stuff out around on Boris bikes, and people were doing exactly that, scraping the data and doing various algorithms on it, and they were then able to identify exact individuals, where they lived, where they worked, and where they went drinking in the evening. And that's just from data that's already out there in the public domain that came from the TfL website. So there's a balancing act from putting that data out there for testing purposes, because no matter how much you pseudo-anonymise it, it's whether it's truly going to be really pure, shall we say, that you're not going to be able to get that critical information from it. So there's a risk, but it's a good idea. Certainly some of the hack days, I know Health has done quite a few of those, they've proved to be quite productive and they get people to look at data in different ways.
I have to say, I absolutely love Kaggle. I think Kaggle's the best thing that's happened in a long time. I love the fact that it allows so many different experts from so many different walks of life and subject matter expertise and knowledge to come together and do that analytics on a bit of data. Whether a company would do it, there has to be a number of driving factors for it. I think it's primarily used for more research and development at the moment. So if there is a research area that needs exploring and it requires insight from a number of different walks of life, and that's a great place to go and try and get that insight. I think companies probably haven't reached that point yet, because R&D isn't as embraced in your ordinary company today. Some specialist companies may have established R&D functions. We've got Zora Labs here as an example of that, and they may have their own way of addressing it. But your ordinary company of today doesn't have that research and development drive. When they do, they may start putting those questions on Kaggle.
One of the concerns I think that some companies may have is they would view having a particular algorithm or approach, or knowing what the best approach is even, as useful information to have, but not useful information for your competitors to have. And so that's sort of inimical to the spirit of open source sorts of approaches. I had the experience about 3 years ago of selling a software company, and one of the most painful parts of selling a software company is having to do a top-to-down detailed code review with a third party in order to establish that our code that we were selling, and one of the main resources of the company, was uncontaminated by anything that had a nasty open source license that would cause headaches down the line when we tried to enforce, when the new owner tried to enforce software licenses. So open source is a cool idea. Kaggle and things like that appeal to the OR geek in me, but at the same time, it's sort of, there's also a way in which one wants to use this stuff to get a competitive edge, at which point having it out in the open sort of creates challenges.
I think we've just got time for one more question, if there is one out there. John. Gavin.
Sorry. Yes. Right. It's not really a question. So many people have stayed right to the end. I've been the main organiser of this event, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers. I've approached them individually. They've all very happily accepted my invitation, and they've all delivered really excellent presentations, and I think provided a very well-balanced day. So thank you very much for your support. That's very much appreciated.
Jonathan, thank you for that. I think it's interesting to actually reflect. Can I just do a show of hands? How many people have been to the previous two of these? So it's about a quarter of the room. I think there's been a real evolution that, and I don't know whether others will reflect on this, maybe it's an over a pint conversation, there's been a real evolution in the three conferences that we've had. Because I very much got the effect that the first one was about, wow, look at the potential of what we could do with all this stuff, but hang on, I'm not really sure it's for me yet. We'll work out what we're going to do when we get back to the ranch. And I think there were then some very specific examples, but they were very niche examples in the second one, when we were actually looking at sort of different areas, and there was a bit more on the financial side as well, and some of the speakers are here again. But it was good today, I think, not just to get that sort of high level from Mark speaking, but also some very generic, specific examples which are coming out, which are much more mainstream now, where analytics and data science is actually going. And I was reflecting on this over coffee, that I think it's a really good evolution, but I suppose a challenge to leave with all of us in the room is, are we actually going fast enough? Because the data's coming in a hell of a lot quicker than I think we're evolving, adapting and making use of it.
I think with that thought, which we can have a long debate about, but I know you've got to battle with the underground system, we shall draw the session to a close. So thank you to everybody for your attendance. I hope you have a good and safe journey home, and we hope to see you in September at the conference. And don't forget the Making an Impact Day. I think Gavin's about to say something.
One, two last things. We'll be sending out a link to a feedback form for everybody, so please, once you receive that, complete it. Tell us how today's gone and how we can improve it for next time. And as we mentioned earlier on, the presentations and the videos should be online as soon as we can possibly do that. Thank you.
Thank you.